Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure I introduce to you the esteemed poet, a great friend of mine and a great mentor, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Phillips.
After such an introduction, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Thank you very much. If you thought it was hard to get me to move from New York to Texas, you should have seen what it took to get my wife here. She'd lived in New York all her life, and finally when I talked about career opportunities and teaching and money, and finally one day she says, all right. She says, I'll move to Texas, but I'll tell you one thing. I'll never use air conditioning. She says, it's against nature, it's unhealthy, and she went on and on and on. And we moved into her house on the 4th of July. And when I came home the afternoon of the 5th of July and opened the door, you could hang meat in that house. She had it up so high the cat was under the covers. Well, I guess we're all adaptable. When it was suggested that I talk about my several careers, at first I was a little perplexed, but on reflection, I guess I have had several. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I'll talk about three of them. My career in advertising, my career as a college administrator, and my career as a creative writing professor. My very first job was as an admissions director for Syracuse University. And I must say that was my least interesting job because all the students had the same questions, you know, what is the student-faculty ratio and how large are the classes? And you can only do that a few thousand times when it wears a little thin. So I moved to New York. I had relatives in New York and had spent summers there. And my hometown originally was a very tiny town in Delaware, 2,000 people. And it had no bookstore, for example. And when I got to New York, I'd run into Barnes & Noble and run into Doubleday and spend whatever money I'd saved during the year. I'd go to Broadway and museums and Central Park and Shea Stadium. So I determined that I should live and work in New York. In college, I'd had a double major. I majored both in advertising and in English. And I decided to look for an advertising job. And you might say, why advertising if you're a poet? Well, it combined many of my interests to begin with: writing, art, photography, acting, and the models were very pretty. And I'd heard it paid well, and it certainly paid better than teaching. My wife and I found a brownstone apartment on the fashionable East 36th Street in one morning. It was the first apartment we looked at, and we said, well, we can't take the first apartment we looked at. And so we went and looked at others, and they were terrible, and we ran back, and it was still available, so we took it. And it was in the brownstone that either had been the home of Admiral Dewey or Commodore Perry. I have since forgotten which. Probably does not matter. But it had a nice parquet floor and a chandelier and a marble fireplace, and it overlooked a garden. And one of our neighbors was the actress Arlene Dahl, who I thought was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life. I'd go out in the hall just hoping to run into Arlene Dahl. The rent was $200 a month, which my relatives thought was just exorbitant, so I told them it was $100 a month. This was in the 60s. Within 2 weeks in New York, my wife had a job as an editor at Macmillan Publishers, and I had a job as an advertising copywriter at Benton & Bowles. I can't imagine finding such an apartment and 2 good jobs within 2 weeks today, but that's how it was in the 60s. Either that or we were better than we thought we were. I would go and write copy during the day. Originally my assignments were not too glamorous, but I later segued into writing for Revlon and Ford Motor Company and some very nice accounts. The job took me to Europe to film, which I certainly enjoyed, and the UK. And after work I would continue to write my poetry and fiction. My first book of poems came out my first year in advertising, and I was thrilled to see that they sold it downstairs in the Tishman building where I worked. The book was called Inner Weather, which is, I'm sure many of you recognize as a phrase stolen from Robert Frost. My colleagues in the creative department were bright and funny and very social. The first Friday I was there, they took me out to lunch at the Art Directors Club. I called it lunch, but no one ordered any food. They ordered pitcher after pitcher of dry martinis. I'd never had a martini before. I not only had a hangover on Saturday, I had a hangover on Sunday. Even today, the odor of juniper berries makes my stomach lurch. Benton & Bowles was where I learned the craft of copywriting. But I was assigned, as I said, to industrial accounts. And so eventually I moved to gray advertising, where I worked on Revlon, Celanese Menswear, Ford Motor Company, and Clearasil. One of my headlines for Clearasil was a trade ad that I wrote, "Pimples can make you rich." One day, the president of the agency called me in and said, "I have a big client coming in today. Bob, can you play golf?" And I said, "Well, I play golf, but I can never get the ball through the little windmill." He was disgusted with me. I also designed a trade display ad to go in stores for Tampax, and the headline was "Stick 'em up." But somehow they never used that. There eventually was an opening in the gray office in Dusseldorf, West Germany, as it was then called. I applied, and my wife and young son and I went. We lived 1 block from the Rhine in what I would call a mansion. Dusseldorf was so central that on weekends we went to Paris, Amsterdam, London. The travel was great, but the comrades were not. They had no sense of humor whatsoever. They didn't appreciate my puns, for example. I was given a long lecture once by one of my colleagues that said, "Herr Phillips, the German language is so precise, there is absolutely no reason for you to make up words." One worker was named Wolfgang, but he called himself Pete. And I said one day, "How come "You don't call yourself Wolfgang." And he says, "Herr Phillips, a wolf is a wild animal. Would you call your son Fox Phillips?" At the office, my co-workers and I generally spoke English. Their English was much better than my Berlitz German. And I tried to explain to someone that my mother's name was Schaefer. Meine Mutter war ein Schäfer. And he replied, "Your mother was a shepherd?" I could have stayed in Dusseldorf indefinitely. The job was very congenial and I got along. But our son was growing to be 6, and we thought we should start him in an American elementary school. And so we moved back. And I transferred to the New York office of Gray. In advertising, you move around a lot, and some of my relatives never understood that. They'd say, "But you've only been at that job 2 years. You've only been at the job 3 years." And well, when accounts move, generally your position is terminated, and you find another account, maybe at another agency. I took subsequent jobs at McCann Erickson and several smaller agencies. Along the way, I began to feel the calling to teach, and not to teach advertising, but to teach creative writing. I'd kept up writing and had published several books, more than several books, actually. I remember a lady walked up to Henry James late in his career and said, "You're Mr. James, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes." Says, "Tell me, have you kept up with your writing?" The notion of Henry James keeping up with his writing just tickles me. So, to answer this feeling that I should be teaching, I took a job teaching at the new school down in Greenwich Village. These were long days. I was teaching and advertising all day, and then racing for a cab to go down and teach at the new school till 9, and then getting a cab and going to Grand Central and taking the train back to northern Westchester. But I certainly don't regret it. I enjoyed the teaching, and the train ride gave me time to do some of my own writing, and I always had a pad in my briefcase. Somewhere along the line, I decided to go full-time as a teacher. First of all, I looked around me, and everyone in the ad agency was much younger than me, and I thought, well, you can see where this is going. So I heard about a job at the University of Houston as director of the writing program, and I applied for it. And I had several friends in the program, among them Cynthia McDonald, and I want to say Daniel Stern, but I brought Dan Stern down, actually, after I was in place. I think a lot of my friends in New York thought I would just die on the vine when I moved to Houston, but that was not so at all. First of all, everything was so much easier in Houston. I mean, I can be anywhere in 15 or 20 minutes by car, whereas in New York, everything was very difficult. And the climate, incidentally, was much better for my arthritis. If you see me get up in the morning, you'd think, "My God, Bob, are you going to make it?" You know. And the climate here is much better. The job was more administrative than creative, though I did teach one class a semester, first undergraduate classes, and eventually graduate students. And I found the teaching exciting, and the students extremely good, particularly the graduate students. We get 300 applications a year for 20 places, 10 poets and 10 fiction writers. And so it's very competitive. And these are people who are committed to writing. Most of them are paying their own way. They really want to do it, and they're very serious about what they're doing. While I found the students very cordial, I found some of my colleagues not too cordial. When I won a major writing award in New York, one asked me, "Why did they select you?" And I said, "Because I'm goddamn good." I think because they thought they'd first hired an administrator, and I kept writing and publishing, some of them were a little put out. After 6 years, I decided to step down as director of the program, and the university changed my position to that of a tenured professor of creative writing. Another of my colleagues said, "We hired Bob to be an administrator, and now we're stuck with him." Stuck with him, they still are. Despite the thorny colleagues, the Houston job has been very good for me. And the thorn birds have retired and been replaced by very congenial colleagues. Classes are small, so I get to know the students very well. There are about 6 to 8 graduates in a class, and even in an undergraduate class, there are no more than 20, usually less. Some people think that my being an admissions writer or an advertising man must have been harmful to my serious writing, but not so. Think about the average TV commercial, for example. You have to get the viewer's attention, introduce the product, demonstrate its benefits, make a sell, and close, all within 30 seconds. That's all probably less than 60 words. That takes an awful lot of editing, a lot of discipline. I wish some of my students had written advertising and could say something in 60 words or less. Many of them go on and on. In order to manage to write my own writing and work long days in ad agencies, I would get up at 4 a.m. and write until 8, then go to the agency. That way, what I considered my real work was behind me, and no matter if the client hated an ad or a campaign, I'd done something no client could touch, and I didn't get upset. Some of my co-workers who lived and died for advertising and did nothing else were just devastated when a client rejected their work. Not me. I tried to keep everything in perspective. Somehow my getting up at 4 a.m. still persists. With no alarm clock, I'm still up at 4 every morning and at my desk or typewriter. My wife thinks I'm a maniac. You notice I said typewriter. I still don't use a computer. I guess I have one of the finest minds in the 19th century. I love my IBM Selectric 3. It never breaks down. You can't kill it. I just have a little problem changing the ribbon. Once I carried the heavy machine to my car and took it to a stationery store in Rice Village and asked them to change the ribbon for me. They thought I was very droll. I've enjoyed my careers very much, except for the admissions job. Advertising centered me in the middle of New York and the centers of art and bookstores. It took me to Europe. Creative writing has brought me to Texas. And at the heart of both is my own writing. When I die, they'll have to break my wrist to keep me from still writing. Scribble, scribble, Professor Phillips. Today, most writers think they have to teach creative writing to pay their bills. I suggest they consider other alternatives: advertising, public relations, real estate, whatever puts them in contact with other people. Teaching writing to students can maybe hurt your perspective on writing. Thank you. Philip Larkin said wisely, "You could only write poetry 1 hour a day. What do you do with the other 23 hours? I have something to do with at least the other 18 hours. I was also asked to address the state of poetry in America today, which is a big topic, of course. Some years ago, I thought it was very bleak. The trade publishers like Doubleday, Macmillan, and Scribner's had all abandoned publishing poetry books. I know I submitted one book to Scribner's, and I got a rejection slip that said, "Scribner's cannot afford to commit to an act of culture." Knopf, Norton, and Athenaeum held on, however. The trade publishers still don't do what they should today, but the university presses took over. Chicago, Wisconsin, NYU, Columbia, Georgia, LSU, all have poetry series. Then a galaxy of small independent publishers took over. Peterloo, Boa Editions, Grey Wolf, Godine, Calvin Carey, Curbstone, Echo are among them. I myself was part of this transition. I went from a mega publisher, Doubleday, who published 800 books a year, to a small university press, Johns Hopkins University Press, and with very happy results. They even consulted me about the jacket art, which no big publisher had ever done before. When my last book of poetry was published, the Brazos bookstore in Houston sold 150 copies in hardback, and Hopkins had the books there on time and in stock. That's a lot of hardback poetry books. Part of the health of poetry in this country today are the poetry book competitions. You usually have to submit a small fee to enter, but the fees pay for the production of advertising the winning book. If you have a poetry manuscript, say 45 to 60 single-page types pages, send it out in multiple submissions. It used to be multiple submissions were a real no-no. It was considered unprofessional, but no longer. They take it for granted that your book is being considered elsewhere. Then there are the poetry readings. Back in the 1950s, there were hardly any poets reading. I remember one at the YMCA in New York City. It was Dylan Thomas. And that was a very hard act for anyone to try to follow. But readings have exploded, as we know, and that's good for poetry. People come to hear your work, and if they like it, they buy your books, either after reading or later in a bookstore. That's good for the poet, good for the publisher, good for the store. I gave one reading in New York City, and afterwards a young boy came up to me and said, "Mr. Phillips, were those real poems or did you write them yourself?" And I said, "I wrote them myself, and I hope they were real poems." And we can't overlook the proliferation of creative writing programs in colleges and universities. There only used to be a few: Iowa, Columbia, Stanford. Now there are legions, all of which teach poetry. The graduates go out into the world to teach poetry writing, usually. I don't think there's any other country in the world that practices or produces so many writing programs and professions. I can speak about our program at the University of Houston, which I directed, as I said, for 6 years, and received 300 applications for 20 places, 10 in poetry, 10 in fiction. That's very competitive. Other good news: Alice Quinn is no longer poetry editor of The New Yorker. When she went there, it was as a fiction editor. When Howard Moss died, extraordinary editor and writer, the editors asked for Miss Quinn to fill in on a temporary basis, and she dug her heels in and was poetry editor for the last 20 years. Neither a poet or a poetry editor. Why do I mention The New Yorker? Because it isn't a quarterly, it's a weekly. 52 issues a year. So they publish a lot of poetry. I have great hope with the new editor. There's also Poetry Magazine of Verse out of Chicago. They recently were given millions and millions of dollars to use as they please. I suspect the monthly issues will be fatter, and they'll publish more books. And don't forget the fine arts foundations that will take a poet for up to 6 months at a time, free of charge, free room and board. These include Yaddo, the Gerasi Foundation, the McDowell Foundation, and others. I think my most productive time was spent at Yaddo and McDowell. The other colonists are forbidden to visit your room or studio until 4 in the afternoon. By that time, you're ready for a drink. It can also be very misleading, however. I remember one poet announcing at dinner one day that she had written 16 poems that afternoon. I'm sure she thought she had. On the national scene, we have a new director of the National Arts Council, who's Dana Gioia, himself a fine poet, and he's increasing support for poetry nationwide. Another recent development in creative writing is students' interest in writing, the personal essay. Many poets shunned writing the short story for some reason, perhaps because it was linear and supposedly not poetic. But despite the fact that many poets wrote both, including James Agee, Delmore Schwartz, Robert Penn Warren, Annie Dillard, Joyce Carol Oates. But the personal essay seems more congenial today to poets and lets them expand on concerns and subjects that the short lyric might seem to confine. What's the downside? Well, with so many creative writers giving lectures and looking for jobs, competition is fierce. And some schools see creative writing as their cash cow. Someone asked Flannery O'Connor if she thought creative writing programs discourage writers. "Not enough of them," she replied. Miss O'Connor has quite a sense of humor. She once wrote a friend in a letter, "Today's election day. That's the day me and my mama go to the polls and cancel out one another's vote." No talk titled "The State of Poetry in America Today" can ignore the state. Wish I could read my own writing. Oh, the state of the state. Okay, in the 1950s, we had the so-called confessional poets. Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, John Berryman, Snodgrass. It seemed to write a poem then, you had to spill your guts all over the page. They were followed by the beat poets, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, Corso. But today, I think we have a greater mixture of subjects and styles. I frankly don't see a predominant force in American poetry today. And for a country as diverse as ours, I think that's just fine. Thank you.
Puns.
Oh, puns. Well, I pun a lot. Maybe that was obvious from a few little things in here. Well, I'd rather laugh than cry. And what I do is humor helps get me through the day. And I guess puns for me are an essential kind of humor.
In spite of the views of your New York cohorts, how do you view the culture of Texas?
Oh, I think the culture of Texas is dandy. Of course, I'm in Houston, which maybe is not all of Texas. Houston is, I think, quite remarkable. First of all, we have the petroleum industry, which has brought in a lot of men, and they brought their wives, and then the wives were dislocated, and so they start up these arts programs and support things. And I can't begin to go to all the cultural things in Houston. And we have very good bookshops. I've mentioned bookshops before. They're very important to me. In fact, when I was brought down to interview for the program in Houston, I asked one of the professors, well, do you have a good bookstore here? And they put me in a car and took me to the Brazos bookstore, and I went in and looked around. I said, yeah, I could live here. You know, that's very important. I should see more of Texas than I have seen. I mean, I've been to Dallas and Austin and so forth, but I should travel more. But being a gentleman of a certain age and a writer, I tend to sit at my desk and not get behind the wheel of the car. Yes?
Would you mind telling us a little bit about circumstances beyond our control in terms of its genesis, maybe? And I think people are curious.
Well, the title probably, who's one of my favorite writers, and I know that someone wrote him a very important note that could have changed his life and slipped it under his door, but instead of going on top of the rug, it went under the rug, and he never saw it, and never knew that that act of kindness had been done. And that's the kind of circumstance that's beyond our control. I've been in automobile accidents. They were beyond my control. It wasn't my fault, and it just felt like a good title for this book. I'm not answering your question very well, but.
And your relationship with John Hopkins University Press has been a good one?
Oh, it's been wonderful. No, it's been just fine. Happened totally by accident. I had been published by Doubleday, as I said, and they in effect went out of the poetry business. And I wrote my friend oh shoot, such a good friend, I'm forgetting his name at the moment. He's a poet. And I asked him, if you had a poetry book this year, where would you send it? And he said, well, I've been very happy with Johns Hopkins Press, and why don't you try it there? And he says the name of the editor is John Irwin. And so I sent it to John Irwin, and 2 weeks later I had a phone call. This is John Irwin. He said, do you have any more poems? And I said, more poems for what? And he says, well, we're doing your book. I just want to fill it out to 72 pages if I can. And that was the first time I knew that they were doing the book. And since then, they've been a wonderful publisher. They do them hardback and paperback. Unfortunately, the hardback of this book, they're charging $35 for it, which for a little slender book, I think that's a bit pricey. But they do have a $12.95 paperback, and even my students can buy that. So. Sure. $2, sure. Terrible to put a price on poetry. I can read it if I can find my glasses. This pocket. Yes, thank you. Can't take. To amplify a little bit on the title, there's an epigraph to the poem, to the book, by Tennessee Williams, one of my favorite writers. I don't believe in villains or heroes, only in right or wrong ways that individuals are taken, not by choice, but by necessity or by certain still uncomprehended influences in themselves, their circumstances, and their antecedents. The first poem is called The Ocean, and it's a soliloquy by the ocean. I slam earth again and again and again and again, not as a pediatrician slaps a newborn to generate first breath, but as a crazed mother slaps and slaps to punish a willful child. I attack with whatever is at my disposal, edges of broken shells, sharp glass shards, whalebones, driftwood planks. I join tropical storms, hurricanes. I erode, surely but slowly, your paltry, grassy dunes. They will fall. I send jellyfish to sting you, octopi to strangle, sharks with willful jaws. I ingest poor fishermen, handsome sailors, our riptide scuba divers, grandchildren. I erode edifices of affluence built with great effrontery within my gaze. Remember, I sank fabulous Atlantis. Remember, I took the Titanic with just one thud. In contempt, I sometimes return a single sneaker or a drowned swimmer. I will win. Already I possess 3/4 of your surface. I will not be ignored. Another slug. Insomnia, something I know a little bit about. When he lived on the lonesome road, in the midst of the woods, he slept deeply as a hibernating bear. When he moved to the city, the sounds of traffic on cement kept him awake all night, until he began to imagine the noise was a soothing waterfall over rocks. His sleeping resumed. A brief poem called Viewing, and in the sense, this kind of viewing is a rather strange practice where you go to a funeral parlor and see an open coffin. They come who have ever loved death better than life, better than love or the incantation of laughter, delighting in the size of the floral display, whispering how natural the painted, powdered smile.